It was supposed to be a peaceful family trip to Canada, but what happened next left them fighting for their lives. While exploring the forest, Sarah, the young daughter of a police captain, encountered a man who changed everything, a local officer hiding a dark secret. Watch until the end to see how this family faced the unimaginable. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The sun was just beginning its descent, casting a warm golden glow over the highway as Mark, a respected captain in his city's police force, drove steadily along the road. His wife, Lisa, sat beside him in the passenger seat, her gaze out the window as she took in the passing scenery, while their daughter, Sarah, sat in the back, happily humming to herself as she tapped her fingers on her phone screen. This journey to Canada had been a long-anticipated escape for their family, a chance to relax, explore, and enjoy each other's company without the weight of daily life hanging over them. The trip had been smooth so far. The car hummed along the highway, the conversations flowing easily. They'd talked about places they wanted to visit, the sights they were excited to see, and how much they were looking forward to exploring the Canadian landscape. Every now and then, Sarah would chime in with questions about Canada, her curiosity lighting up her parents' faces with joy. Mark and Lisa exchanged knowing glances, happy to see their daughter so excited. For a moment, it felt like nothing could go wrong on this trip. Mark glanced at the dashboard. They'd been driving for a few hours, and he figured it was about time to stop for a quick break. They were approaching a heavily wooded area where tall trees lined the sides of the road, their branches arching above to form a natural canopy. The fading light filtered through the leaves, casting a serene, almost magical ambiance around them. They were entering a remote stretch of road, but Mark didn't mind. It was peaceful here. "Let's stop soon," he said, glancing over at Lisa. "Stretch our legs, maybe get some fresh air. Sound good?" Lisa nodded, smiling. "I could use a break, and I think Sarah's due for some fresh air too." Sarah looked up from her phone, a wide grin on her face. "Can I explore the woods? Just a little bit?" "Maybe a short walk," Mark agreed, a small chuckle escaping his lips. He knew Sarah's love for nature. She was a curious spirit, always eager to wander and explore. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her, though. This area seemed safe, but Mark's instincts as a cop never fully rested. They drove a few more miles before Mark noticed a small clearing at the side of the road. He slowed down, signaling as he pulled over, parking the car. The air was cool and crisp as they stepped out, a refreshing change from the stuffy car. Mark stretched his arms above his head, loosening muscles that had grown tight from hours behind the wheel. Lisa took a deep breath, closing her eyes to savor the freshness of the air, while Sarah eagerly looked around, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Stay close," Mark reminded her as she wandered a few feet away. "We're in the middle of nowhere out here." "Yes, Dad," she said, a playful smile on her face as she rolled her eyes. "I'm not going far." Mark shook his head with a grin, watching her carefully as she moved a little farther, stopping now and then to examine a flower or a fallen branch. He knew she was responsible, but he couldn't help the slight worry that bubbled up in him. After all, they were in unfamiliar territory. Just as Mark and Lisa were beginning to relax, Mark noticed something odd. The car suddenly sputtered and then went silent. The quiet hum of the engine that had been so steady throughout the journey was gone. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked, turning her head toward him with a concerned look. "Not sure," Mark muttered, already moving back to the car to check. "Could be something minor. Maybe a loose connection or an issue with the battery." He opened the hood and started inspecting the engine. Everything looked fine at first glance, but as he looked closer, he noticed an issue with one of the cables. It was loose, possibly from the long drive, and it seemed like something he could fix. He gave Lisa a reassuring nod. "This shouldn't take long," he told her, rolling up his sleeves. Lisa leaned against the car, watching him as he worked, a slight frown of worry on her face. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to explore nearby, sticking within eyesight as she wandered through the trees. She seemed completely taken by the quiet beauty of the forest, pausing every now and then to examine a particularly interesting leaf or listen to the sound of a bird's song echoing through the trees. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting longer shadows as evening approached. Lisa glanced at her phone, noting the time. "Do you think we'll be able to make it before dark?" Mark glanced up from the engine, a bit of grease on his fingers. "Shouldn't be a problem. Just need another few minutes here and we'll be back on our way." He was confident he could get them moving again soon, and the idea of being stranded in the middle of the forest with nightfall approaching didn't exactly appeal to him. He worked quickly, double-checking the connections and making sure everything was secure. He wanted to be sure that once they were moving, they wouldn't run into any more issues. Back in the trees, Sarah wandered a bit further, her steps soft on the moss-covered ground. She was enthralled by the serenity around her, feeling as though she'd stepped into another world, far from the rush and noise of the city. She knew her father would call her back soon, but she wanted to enjoy this peaceful moment just a little longer. Just then, Sarah's attention was drawn to a glint through the trees. She squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, she thought it might be a bird or an animal, but as she moved a bit closer, she realized it was the surface of a frozen lake, nestled among the trees like a hidden gem. Excitement sparked within her, and she glanced back toward her parents, barely able to see them now through the trees. She knew she shouldn't wander too far, but the sight was too tempting to resist. She approached the lake carefully, her breath visible in the chilly air. The ice was smooth, a glassy surface that reflected the dimming light, and for a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the beauty of it. She felt a strange mix of awe and excitement, a rush of adrenaline as she stepped onto the ice, testing it with her weight. It held firm beneath her feet, and she took a few more tentative steps, gliding across the surface as though she were dancing. Back at the car, Mark was finishing up with the repairs, tightening the last bolt and wiping his hands with a rag. "All set," he said with a satisfied smile, glancing back at Lisa. But his smile faded as he realized Sarah was nowhere in sight. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, a hint of worry slipping into his voice. Lisa looked up, her eyes scanning the trees. "She was just there," she replied, frowning. They both called out her name, their voices echoing through the quiet forest. No answer. Mark's pulse quickened as he closed the hood of the car and started toward the trees, his gaze scanning the area for any sign of his daughter. He knew Sarah was responsible, but they were in unfamiliar woods, and the shadows were growing longer with each passing minute. He picked up his pace, his voice growing louder as he called her name again. An uneasy feeling settled in his stomach as he moved further into the forest. In the back of his mind, a small, insistent worry grew stronger. As he continued his search, unaware of what was happening near the lake, he could only hope that Sarah hadn't wandered too far. But as he moved through the trees, a sense of urgency took hold, and he quickened his steps, his voice echoing into the quiet, growing darkness. The forest seemed to wrap around Sarah like a comforting blanket as she ventured deeper among the trees. The soft crunch of snow under her boots and the crisp, cold air filled her with a sense of exhilaration. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Every now and then, a gust of wind would send a shower of snowflakes drifting down from the treetops, glistening like tiny diamonds. She felt a world away from the car and her parents, but she knew she hadn't gone too far. The allure of the untouched snow and the serene silence was too tempting to resist. She breathed deeply, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold air. As she walked, she noticed the tracks of small animals imprinted in the snow and paused to wonder what creatures they might belong to. After a few minutes, Sarah came upon a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a stunning sight. A vast, frozen lake stretched out before her, its surface smooth and reflective like a giant mirror. The ice gleamed under the pale sunlight, a sheet of silver set against the dark greens and browns of the surrounding forest. She stood at the edge, her eyes wide with awe, taking in the breathtaking beauty of the scene. Unable to resist, she stepped cautiously onto the ice. It felt solid beneath her feet, and she took a few tentative steps, testing its strength. A grin spread across her face as she grew more confident, her footsteps leaving faint marks on the pristine surface. The sensation was exhilarating, almost as if she were walking on air. She imagined herself as an adventurer discovering a hidden world, a place untouched and secret. As she ventured further out, she turned slowly in a circle, taking in the panoramic view. The quiet was profound. The only sounds were the soft whispers of the wind and the distant call of a bird. She felt a deep sense of peace, a connection to the natural world that was both humbling and invigorating. Lost in her thoughts, Sarah almost didn't notice the figure emerging from the tree line on the opposite shore. A movement caught her eye, and she squinted to get a better look. At first, it was just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of snow-covered pines. As the figure drew closer, details began to emerge. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a uniform that became more distinguishable with each step. Her heart gave a slight flutter. A local policeman, she thought. Perhaps he was on patrol or simply enjoying the scenery like she was. She felt a mix of curiosity and reassurance. After all, police officers were there to help people, weren't they? The man continued to approach, his boots crunching audibly on the snow-covered ice. There was something deliberate about his stride, purposeful. As he came closer, Sarah could make out his features, a stern face with sharp eyes that seemed to study her intently. His uniform was neat, but there was an air about him that made her feel slightly uneasy. "Hello there," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet expanse. It was deep and gruff, not unfriendly, but lacking warmth. "Hi," Sarah replied, offering a small smile. She felt a sudden self-consciousness, aware that she was alone on a frozen lake with a stranger. "What brings you out here all by yourself?" he asked, stopping a few yards away. His eyes flicked over her, taking in her appearance. "I'm just exploring," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "My parents are nearby. Our car broke down, and I went for a walk while we wait." He nodded slowly, but his gaze remained fixed on her in a way that made her shift her weight uncomfortably. "These woods can be dangerous if you don't know your way around," he remarked. "Especially for someone like you." Sarah frowned slightly, unsure of his meaning. "Oh, I'm not going far. I can find my way back easily." He took a step closer. "Still, might be best if you head back soon. You never know what could happen out here." There was an edge to his voice now, a subtle hint of something that put her on alert. She glanced back in the direction she had come, though the trees obscured any view of her parents or the road. "I was just about to head back, actually," she said, taking a small step backward. "It was nice to meet you." He didn't move, his eyes still locked on hers. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she answered reluctantly. "Well, Sarah, you should be more careful," he said. "Not everyone you meet out here is as friendly as me." The words hung in the air, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold temperature. Her instincts told her that something was off. She mustered a polite smile. "Thank you for the advice. I'll be going now." She turned slowly, trying not to appear rushed, but as she started to walk away, she heard the sound of his footsteps following her. Her heartbeat quickened. "Is there something else?" she asked over her shoulder. "No law against making sure a young lady gets back safely," he replied, though his tone didn't match the sentiment. She nodded, facing forward again, her mind racing. Why did he make her feel so uneasy? He was a policeman, someone she should be able to trust, yet every instinct screamed at her to put distance between them. They walked in silence for a few moments, his presence heavy behind her. The shore seemed farther away than before, and she silently cursed herself for venturing so far out. She quickened her pace slightly, but his steps matched hers. "Your parents," he began slowly, "they wouldn't happen to be from around here, would they?" "No, we're just passing through," she replied, hoping the conversation would end there. "Thought so," he said. "Not many folks like you in these parts." She glanced back at him, catching a smirk on his face that sent a jolt of fear through her. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing," he said lightly. "Just making conversation." She faced forward again, her eyes scanning for the quickest path back to the safety of her parents. The ice beneath her seemed to creak softly, or perhaps it was her imagination amplified by anxiety. "You know," he continued, "it's important to respect local customs when you're a guest somewhere." "I'm sure we do," she replied tersely. He chuckled, a low sound that made her skin crawl. "I hope so. It would be a shame if someone didn't appreciate the way things are done here." She didn't respond, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, willing herself to stay calm. The shore was getting closer, but not fast enough. Suddenly, he moved alongside her, cutting off her path. She stopped, startled. "Excuse me," she said, trying to step around him. He stepped in her way again. "In a hurry?" "My parents will be worried," she said firmly. "I need to get back." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I should have a word with them, make sure they understand how things work around here." She felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "There's no need for that. Please let me pass." He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "If you insist." She moved past him, her heart pounding. Just a little farther, she told herself. Stay calm. But as she walked away, she heard him mutter under his breath, words she couldn't quite make out, but felt were meant to intimidate. She increased her pace, not daring to look back. Without warning, she heard a sharp crack beneath her feet. She froze, realizing that she'd unknowingly wandered toward a thinner part of the ice. Panic surged through her as she felt the surface shift slightly. "Careful now," the policeman called out, a hint of mock concern in his voice. "Wouldn't want you to fall through." She carefully tried to retrace her steps, but each movement seemed to make the ice groan in protest. "I think the ice is thin here," she said, her voice trembling. He stood where he was, a slight smile on his face. "You should watch where you're going." "Can you help me?" she asked, her eyes pleading. He tilted his head thoughtfully. "I suppose I could, but maybe this is a lesson in being careful." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Please," she whispered. He sighed dramatically. "All right. Take small steps back toward me." She began to move slowly, but another crack sounded, louder this time. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hold still," he instructed, but made no move to assist her. "Please help me," she repeated, her voice barely audible. He met her gaze, his eyes cold. "Maybe you should have listened when I told you to be careful." Before she could respond, the ice gave way beneath her feet. She let out a scream as she plunged into the freezing water, the shock stealing the breath from her lungs. The cold enveloped her like a vice, every muscle seizing up as she struggled to keep her head above water. "Help!" she cried out, her voice weak against the vast emptiness. The policeman stood at the edge of the broken ice, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Should have been more careful," he said softly. "Please," she begged, her strength fading as the cold sapped her energy. He turned away slowly, leaving her struggling in the icy water. "Not my problem," he muttered as he walked back toward the trees. Panic and disbelief overwhelmed her. She tried to grasp the edge of the ice, but it broke away in her hands. The cold was relentless, pulling her down. Her vision blurred as tears mixed with the frigid water. As darkness edged into her vision, she thought of her parents, unaware of the danger she was in. Summoning the last of her strength, she let out one final, desperate scream before the cold engulfed her completely. Mark's pulse raced as he called Sarah's name again, his voice echoing through the quiet forest. He knew she wouldn't have wandered far, yet an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Lisa had stayed behind by the car, watching the trees anxiously, her face lined with worry. The shadows in the forest had deepened as evening settled in, stretching across the ground in thin fingers. Mark's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he scanned the woods. The forest, so serene earlier, now felt foreboding, each sound amplified by his growing concern. "Sarah!" he called out, louder this time. Silence answered him, a silence so complete it was almost suffocating. He walked faster, stepping over fallen branches and crunching through snow as he moved deeper into the woods. He felt a pang of guilt, wishing he'd kept her closer, but he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on finding her. Every second that passed felt heavier, his sense of urgency intensifying. After a few minutes, he caught sight of an open area through the trees where the branches gave way to a clearing. As he stepped closer, he realized it was a frozen lake, its smooth, glassy surface reflecting the dimming light. His gaze swept across it, and his heart clenched as he spotted someone, moving in the distance, near the center of the ice. It was Sarah. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood a few yards away from her, a man in a dark uniform that Mark recognized immediately as a police officer's. Relief washed over him, but only briefly. Something about the scene felt wrong. The man's posture, the way he loomed over Sarah, the tense set of his shoulders, it was all wrong. Then, before Mark could fully process what he was seeing, the ice beneath Sarah's feet gave a loud, echoing crack, and he watched in horror as she disappeared into the water, her small figure sinking through the shattered ice. "No!" The word ripped from his throat as he sprinted forward, adrenaline surging through him. He moved as fast as he could, but the snow slowed his steps, each second stretching agonizingly long. His breath came in sharp, short gasps as he approached the edge of the lake. To his disbelief, the policeman stood unmoving at the edge of the broken ice, watching as Sarah struggled in the freezing water, doing nothing to help her. "Help her!" Mark shouted as he reached the shore, but the man didn't respond, merely turning his gaze toward Mark with an expression that was shockingly indifferent. Mark didn't waste another moment. He stepped onto the ice, his movements careful but quick as he made his way toward the spot where Sarah had fallen. Every crack, every groan of the ice beneath his feet sent a jolt of fear through him, but he pushed it aside, his focus solely on reaching his daughter. As he neared the hole in the ice, he could see Sarah's hand clawing weakly at the edge, her face pale and her movement sluggish as the cold took its toll on her. She was barely above the water, her head bobbing as she struggled to keep from sinking. "Sarah!" he called, reaching out as he approached. "Hold on, I'm coming." With one last burst of energy, he lunged forward, his hand grasping hers. The shock of her freezing skin sent a wave of urgency through him as he pulled her upward, using every ounce of strength he had to haul her onto the ice. She was limp, her face pale and her body shivering violently. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice trembling as he pulled her into his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused but recognizing him. "Dad," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her lips were blue, her skin cold as ice. He held her close, trying to shield her from the wind as he turned back toward the shore. But as he began to move, he felt a dark presence behind him. Mark turned his gaze back, catching sight of the policeman standing a few feet away, his expression devoid of empathy. "What's wrong with you?" Mark spat, his voice thick with fury and disbelief. "You just stood there and watched her drown." The man shrugged, his lips twisting into a cold smile. "Not my problem," he said dismissively, his tone laced with disdain. "Should have kept a closer eye on her." Mark's jaw clenched as he struggled to keep his anger in check. His instinct screamed at him to confront the man, but Sarah's shallow breaths reminded him of his priority. He had to get her to safety, and any confrontation with this officer would have to wait. "You're a disgrace," Mark said, his voice low and laced with venom. "Don't think this will go unpunished." The officer merely chuckled, crossing his arms as he watched Mark retreat, his mocking gaze following them. Mark felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to turn away, focusing on getting Sarah back to the shore. As he walked carefully back across the ice, each step calculated to avoid another collapse, he whispered words of encouragement to Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hang on, baby. We're almost there. Just a little longer." Reaching the edge of the lake, he carefully stepped off the ice, cradling Sarah in his arms. Lisa was already running toward them, her face filled with terror as she saw their daughter's condition. "Oh my God, Sarah!" Lisa cried, reaching out to touch her daughter's face. "She's freezing!" "We need to get her to the car and turn on the heat," Mark said urgently, his voice shaking. "Then we'll find the nearest hospital." They hurried back to the car, Lisa opening the door as Mark laid Sarah across the back seat, wrapping her in blankets they kept for emergencies. He quickly turned the heater on full blast, hoping the warmth would bring some color back to her pale cheeks. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her eyes barely open. Mark knelt beside her, gently brushing the damp hair from her forehead, his heart aching as he looked at his daughter's weakened state. He couldn't shake the image of that policeman standing idly by, watching her suffer. The thought filled him with a sense of helpless rage, but he pushed it aside for now. His daughter needed him. "Stay with us, Sarah," he murmured, his hand gripping hers tightly. "We're going to get you help." Lisa climbed into the car, her face wet with tears as she stroked Sarah's arm, her voice filled with desperation. Please, sweetheart, just hang on." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before starting the car. He drove carefully but urgently, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, where he could see Sarah lying still under the blankets, her face pale and her eyes closed. As they sped along the darkening road, he replayed the events at the lake in his mind, each detail fueling his anger. He had been a police officer for years, had dedicated his life to serving and protecting, and he couldn't fathom how another officer could act with such cold indifference. It was a betrayal of everything he believed in. They reached a hospital on the outskirts of the nearest town, and Mark pulled into the emergency entrance. He rushed to open the door and lifted Sarah into his arms, carrying her inside with Lisa by his side. Medical staff quickly took over, wheeling Sarah away on a stretcher as Mark and Lisa watched anxiously. As they sat in the waiting room, Mark's mind kept returning to that policeman by the lake. His heart ached with worry for Sarah, but a new determination had settled over him. He would make sure that officer faced consequences for what he'd done. That man had abandoned his duty, had left a child to suffer and almost die, all because of his own prejudice and cruelty. Lisa's hand found his, and he squeezed it, both of them clinging to each other for comfort as they waited for news of their daughter's condition. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached them, her face serious but calm. "Your daughter is stable," she said. "She was severely hypothermic, but we've managed to get her body temperature back up. She's resting now." Relief washed over Mark and Lisa, and they clung to each other, the weight of their fear finally easing. "Can we see her?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling with hope. The doctor nodded, leading them down a quiet hallway to a small room where Sarah lay, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. She looked frail, wrapped in layers of blankets, but the color was beginning to return to her cheeks. Mark pulled a chair up beside her bed, taking her hand in his thumb gently tracing circles on her skin. Lisa sat beside him, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. As they sat in silence, Mark's mind drifted back to the lake, to the officer who had caused this nightmare. He clenched his jaw, a fierce resolve building within him. This wasn't over. He would ensure that justice was served, that the man who had almost taken his daughter's life would face the consequences of his actions. Mark knew what he had to do, and he wouldn't rest until that officer was held accountable. For now, though, he was content to sit by Sarah's side, holding her hand and watching over her, a quiet vow of protection lingering in his heart. The hospital room was dim, the soft hum of machines providing a steady rhythm as Sarah slept under a cocoon of warm blankets. Mark sat beside her, his face drawn with exhaustion and anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had watched his daughter struggle in the icy water while that officer, someone sworn to protect, had stood there doing nothing. His heart clenched at the memory, his anger growing sharper with each beat. Lisa was by his side, her hand resting protectively on Sarah's, her face a portrait of worry. They had barely spoken since Sarah had been brought in, each lost in their thoughts. But as the hours stretched on and the adrenaline began to wane, Mark knew he could no longer keep his anger contained. He needed answers. "I'll be back soon," he murmured to Lisa, squeezing her shoulder gently. She looked up, concern flashing in her eyes. "Mark, where are you going?" "I need to talk to someone. I can't just sit here and do nothing." His voice was low, but the determination in it was unmistakable. Lisa nodded, understanding. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that he wouldn't rest until he had confronted the man who had endangered their daughter. Mark left the room, his steps purposeful as he made his way to the hospital's front desk. He approached the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who looked up at him with a polite smile. "Is there a police station nearby?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The receptionist blinked in surprise, then nodded. "Yes, there's a small station just a few blocks down the road." Mark thanked her and headed out, his mind set. The chilly night air hit him as he stepped outside, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were focused, a single goal driving him forward as he made his way toward the station. The building was small and unassuming, a stark contrast to the larger police departments he was used to. As he approached, he saw a lone officer sitting at the front desk, looking up as Mark entered. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, glancing over him with mild curiosity. Mark pulled out his own badge, holding it up as he approached. "Captain Mark Ellis. I'm looking for one of your officers. He was at the lake today. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair. I need his name." The officer blinked, a hint of surprise flickering across his face before he nodded. That sounds like Officer Ross. He's around here somewhere." He seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether he should proceed. "Get him," Mark said, his voice cold. There was no room for hesitation. The officer swallowed, nodding before standing and disappearing down a hallway. Mark remained where he was, his jaw clenched as he waited. It wasn't long before he heard footsteps approaching, and then he saw him. The man from the lake, Officer Ross, with the same indifferent expression on his face. Ross looked at Mark with a faint smirk. "You wanted to see me?" Mark took a step forward, his voice low and measured. "You left my daughter to drown. You stood there and watched as she fought for her life, and you did nothing." Ross shrugged, his smirk widening. "Kid shouldn't have been out on the ice. Not my fault she didn't know any better." Mark's hands balled into fists, his muscles tense as he fought to keep his composure. "It's your job to protect people. What you did wasn't just neglect. It was cruelty. You endangered her life, and you'll answer for that." Ross let out a chuckle, crossing his arms. "What are you going to do about it? We're in my jurisdiction here. Your badge doesn't mean anything." Mark met his gaze, his eyes cold. "That's where you're wrong." Ross's smirk faltered slightly, and he glanced away, the confidence in his posture wavering. But he quickly masked it, straightening his shoulders. "Look," Ross said, trying to brush it off. "She's fine now, isn't she? No harm done." "No harm done." Mark's voice was a deadly whisper. "You almost killed my daughter, and now you're going to face the consequences." Ross snorted, rolling his eyes. "Good luck with that. Around here, we take care of our own." Mark's anger flared, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll be filing a complaint, not just here, but with every authority I can reach. You can count on that." He turned sharply, leaving Ross standing there, his smirk now fading as he watched Mark walk away. Mark didn't look back. His mind was already racing with the next steps, his thoughts sharp and precise. He wouldn't let this go. He would ensure that Ross was held accountable, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Back at the hospital, he returned to Sarah's room, his expression grim but resolved. Lisa looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. "What happened?" she asked softly. "I confronted him," Mark replied, his tone clipped. "He showed no remorse, but I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with it." Lisa reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Do whatever you have to do, Mark. We're with you." He nodded, his gaze returning to Sarah, who was still asleep, her breathing steady and her face finally showing some color. The sight eased his heart slightly, but he knew he couldn't rest until Ross faced the consequences. The next morning, Mark was up early, making phone calls to contacts he had within the police force and various authorities. He reported Ross's actions, detailing the officer's failure to act and the racial undertones that had driven him to abandon Sarah on the ice. His anger fueled each call, his words sharp as he recounted the horrifying events. Over the next few days, the wheels of justice began to turn. Investigators were sent to question Ross, witnesses were sought, and Mark's complaint became the catalyst for an internal investigation. News of the incident began to spread, raising questions about Ross's fitness for duty and casting a shadow over his career. Throughout this, Mark remained focused, checking in on Sarah between meetings and calls. She was improving steadily, her strength returning bit by bit, though the trauma of the incident had left its mark on her. Each time he saw her, he felt a renewed determination to see justice done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he received word from the Internal Affairs Department. Ross had been suspended, pending further investigation. It was a step in the right direction, but Mark knew it wasn't enough. Ross needed to face real consequences, not just a temporary suspension. He filed additional charges, pressing for Ross to be prosecuted for endangering a minor and violating his oath as an officer. He knew it would be a battle, but he was prepared to fight it. As days turned into weeks, the case gained traction, and Ross's misdeeds came under public scrutiny. Testimonies from other locals who had encountered Ross painted a picture of a man who had a long history of prejudice and abuse of power. The public outcry grew louder, fueled by Mark's relentless pursuit of justice. Finally, a court date was set. Mark attended every hearing, his presence a reminder that he wouldn't back down until justice was served. Ross's smug demeanor had faded, replaced by a quiet desperation as he realized the consequences of his actions were unavoidable. In the end, Ross was found guilty on multiple counts, his career in ruins. He was sentenced to prison, and the satisfaction in Mark's heart was mixed with a lingering bitterness. He knew nothing could erase what had happened to Sarah, but he took comfort in knowing that Ross would never harm another person again. Returning to the hospital after the sentencing, Mark entered Sarah's room, where Lisa was sitting by her side. Sarah looked up as he walked in, her eyes tired but filled with a spark of gratitude. "It's over," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "He won't hurt anyone else." Sarah managed a small smile, her hand reaching out to grasp his. "Thank you, Dad." He wrapped her hand in his, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift slightly. They had fought, they had struggled, but they had come out the other side together. That night, as he sat by Sarah's side, Mark felt a sense of peace. He had faced down the worst and emerged stronger, his family united by the ordeal. He knew they had a long road ahead, but he also knew they would face it together, their bond unbreakable. The sterile white lights of the hospital halls cast a harsh glow as Mark and Lisa waited anxiously outside Sarah's room. The day's ordeal had left both of them exhausted, but neither could bring themselves to leave their daughter's side. She was finally resting peacefully, her breathing even and her face regaining some of its natural color, but the trauma lingered, and the memory of her struggle still haunted them both. Mark sat slumped in a chair beside her bed, his face shadowed with fatigue and worry. His mind reeled with thoughts of the officer who had put his daughter in this situation, but he pushed the anger aside for now, focusing instead on Sarah. Each time he looked at her, a mix of relief and pain welled up within him. He had nearly lost her. Lisa stood by the window, her gaze distant, lost in thoughts of the day's events. She had barely spoken since they'd arrived, her worry for Sarah consuming her completely. They both knew she was lucky to be alive, but the shock of nearly losing her had left them both shaken. A knock at the door interrupted the silence, and a nurse stepped in, her face kind but serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Ellis, the doctor would like to speak with you about Sarah's condition." Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance, then followed the nurse down the hallway to a small office where the doctor waited, his expression calm but serious. "Please, have a seat," he said, motioning to the chairs opposite his desk. Mark and Lisa sat down, both feeling a sense of dread. The doctor cleared his throat, folding his hands on the desk. "First, let me say that Sarah is stable and resting comfortably. She's a strong young girl, and her vital signs have improved significantly since she was admitted." Lisa let out a sigh of relief, her hand clutching Mark's tightly. "However," the doctor continued, "she was exposed to extreme cold for a prolonged period, which has led to some complications. Her body is still recovering from the hypothermia, and we'll need to monitor her closely over the next few days to ensure there are no lasting effects." Mark nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "We'll do whatever it takes to help her recover." The doctor nodded. "That's good to hear. She'll need plenty of rest, and it might take some time for her body to fully regain its strength. But with proper care, I'm confident she'll make a full recovery." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for everything." The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "Of course, Sarah's been through a lot, but she's shown incredible resilience. We'll keep a close watch on her, and you can be here with her as much as you'd like." Mark and Lisa thanked the doctor again before making their way back to Sarah's room. As they entered, they found her still asleep, her face peaceful and her breathing steady. The sight filled them both with a profound sense of gratitude, and they sat by her side, taking comfort in her presence. The hours slipped by in quiet vigil. Nurses came and went, checking Sarah's vitals and adjusting her IV. Mark and Lisa stayed close, their worry easing slightly with each passing hour. Sarah was safe now, and for the first time since the ordeal began, they felt a small glimmer of hope. Finally, as dawn broke, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, her gaze shifting to her parents, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "Mom? Dad?" she murmured, her voice weak but clear. Lisa leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "We're here, sweetheart. You're safe." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently. "How are you feeling, honey?" Sarah's smile wavered, her eyes clouding with memories of the lake. "I'm okay, just tired." Her parents exchanged a look, their relief tempered by the pain they saw in her eyes. Mark knew that her physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars would take time. He would be there for her, though, every step of the way. Over the next few days, Sarah's strength slowly returned. She was able to sit up in bed, and her appetite improved as she regained her energy. The doctors and nurses were pleased with her progress, and each day brought her closer to a full recovery. But while Sarah's physical health improved, her spirit seemed subdued. She was quieter than usual, often lost in thought, her gaze distant. Mark and Lisa tried to comfort her, but they could sense the lingering fear and sadness beneath her smiles. One evening, as Mark sat beside her, he noticed her fidgeting with the edge of her blanket, her expression troubled. "Something on your mind?" he asked gently, his voice soft. She hesitated, her eyes downcast. I don't understand why he did it. That policeman, he just stood there and watched me fall. He laughed when I was in the water." Her voice trembled, the hurt and confusion evident in her tone. Mark's jaw tightened, his anger flaring again at the memory. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Some people, they let their own hate and prejudice get in the way of doing the right thing. What he did was wrong, and he's going to face the consequences for it." Sarah looked up at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Will he really?" "Yes," Mark said firmly, his gaze steady. "I've reported him, and there's an investigation underway. He won't get away with what he did." She nodded slowly, a hint of relief easing the tension in her face. "Thank you, Dad." Mark reached out, gently squeezing her hand. "You're safe now, Sarah. No one's going to hurt you again." She managed a small smile, and Mark felt a surge of pride for her resilience. She had been through a nightmare, but she was strong. They would get through this as a family. As Sarah's condition continued to improve, the day finally came when the doctor informed them that she could be discharged. Mark and Lisa were overjoyed, eager to bring her home and give her the comfort and care she needed. They carefully helped Sarah into a wheelchair, bundling her up in warm clothes before wheeling her out to the car. The fresh air felt invigorating after so many days in the hospital, and Sarah breathed deeply, a faint smile on her lips as they stepped outside. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Mark kept glancing at Sarah in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. They had come so close to losing her, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they had been given a second chance. As they pulled into their driveway, Mark helped Sarah out of the car, supporting her as they made their way to the front door. Lisa opened it, stepping aside to let them in, her face bright with relief as they finally returned home. Once inside, Mark settled Sarah on the couch, arranging pillows around her for comfort. Lisa brought her a warm cup of tea, and they sat together, savoring the quiet peace of their home. For the first time in days, Mark allowed himself to relax, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Sarah was safe, and they were home. The ordeal had left its mark on them all, but they had come through it together, their bond stronger than ever. That evening, as they sat together in the warmth of their living room, Mark felt a sense of closure. The investigation into Ross's actions was ongoing, and he knew justice would be served. But for now, he was content to simply be with his family, holding them close and cherishing each moment. The past few days had been a harsh reminder of how fragile life could be, but it had also shown him the strength of love and resilience. They would move forward, heal, and continue on their journey, stronger than before. Mark glanced at Sarah, who was drifting off to sleep, her face peaceful as she rested against the cushions. He reached out, gently brushing a hand over her hair, his heart filled with gratitude. No matter what lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. Days turned into weeks, and though Sarah was back home and recovering, Mark's resolve remained as sharp as ever. The memories of that day by the lake, the cold indifference in Officer Ross's eyes as Sarah struggled in the icy water, haunted him daily. He'd channeled every ounce of his frustration and anger into the investigation, determined to see Ross held accountable. Mark had filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, sparking an inquiry into Ross's conduct. His reputation within the police force and the respect he commanded among his colleagues had given weight to his claims, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. This was a case that required evidence, witnesses, and a determined pursuit of justice. Lisa was a steady support by his side, encouraging him every step of the way. She had seen the toll the ordeal had taken on Mark, both as a father and as a man who had devoted his life to law and order. But Mark was undeterred. This wasn't just about personal justice. It was a fight for the very principles he'd built his career on. Finally, the day came when Mark received a call from Internal Affairs. The investigation had gathered enough evidence for a hearing. Ross would be brought before a disciplinary board where his actions on the day of the incident would be scrutinized. The hearing was held in a large, solemn room at the local courthouse, a place Mark knew well from years of serving on the force. He sat in the front row, dressed in his formal uniform, his gaze steady and unyielding as he watched Ross enter the room, flanked by his lawyer. Ross looked different now. His once arrogant smirk replaced by a hardened expression, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Gone was the smugness, replaced by a tense defensiveness as he took his seat. The board members filed in, a panel of senior officers and officials who would weigh the evidence and determine Ross's fate. The lead investigator opened the proceedings, reading aloud the charges against him: neglect of duty, endangerment of a minor, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Each word fell heavily in the silence of the room, a stark reminder of the gravity of his actions. Mark sat, his face impassive, as the prosecutor began presenting the case. Witnesses were called, each providing testimony that painted a damning picture of Ross's behavior. Sarah's statement was read aloud, her words a poignant recounting of the fear and helplessness she had felt as Ross had stood by, watching her struggle without offering help. Her voice, captured in the written testimony, echoed in Mark's mind as he sat there, the pain of her experience renewed with each word. But he kept his composure, his focus unwavering. This was the path to justice, and he would see it through. The hearing continued with testimonies from locals who had encountered Ross before, detailing instances of racial prejudice and unnecessary aggression. Mark had gathered every shred of evidence he could find, leaving no room for doubt. Ross had abused his power, and it was time for him to face the consequences. When it was finally Ross's turn to speak, he stood, his eyes scanning the room nervously. His lawyer had coached him well, and he tried to project an image of remorse, his voice steady as he addressed the board. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt," Ross said, his voice carefully measured. "It was a difficult situation, and I misjudged the circumstances. I regret that my actions caused harm, and I apologize to the family." Mark felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ross. He could see through the carefully crafted facade, the hollow words meant to sway the board. There was no true remorse in his voice, only a calculated attempt to escape punishment. The board members asked questions, probing deeper into his motivations, but Ross's answers were vague, filled with excuses and deflections. He tried to downplay the severity of his actions, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance rather than the perpetrator of cruelty. When it came time for Mark to speak, he stood, his posture straight and his voice steady. "Officer Ross left my daughter to drown," he began, his tone calm but firm. "He stood by watching as she struggled in the freezing water, and he did nothing. This wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate choice, a failure to uphold the duty he swore to fulfill." He paused, his gaze